Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our latest webinar from ALM Works. Today we have a customer that will be doing all of the presenting. No one from ALM Works is presenting today. So that will be interesting, I think, hopefully for everyone, that they get to hear directly from a customer who's had an interesting journey with Jira and structure. Next slide, please. Before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. Everyone's microphone is muted today. With this number of participants, it's not unusual for there to be sirens or barking dogs in the background. We've learned early on that it's best if we use the written Q&A function of our webinar platform. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see something that looks like a folder with a Q on it, and below that it says Q&A. And that is where you can enter a question at any time. We'll take questions at the end, but if you have a question occurs to you during the webinar, please just click on that button, type in your question, and we'll answer it at the end. If for some reason we don't get to everyone's question, we promise we'll follow up with you directly. So don't worry if we don't get a chance to read and answer your question in real time. And then lastly, this webinar is being recorded. There will be an archive available. We'll have to say more about that towards the end of the presentation, but you'll be able to come back and review the content of the webinar, share it with a colleague if you'd like. So we hope that's useful for you as well. Next slide, please. So today's speaker is Mike Rathwell. Mike is a Jira Administrator at Weedmaps, and he's also an Atlassian online community leader. That's how I became acquainted with Mike. My name is Dave Rosenlund, by the way. I didn't introduce myself. I'm here just as the host today. But Mike is someone I happen to see on the Atlassian community, frequently answering questions about structure. And so I reached out to him one day and I said, hey, you seem to know a lot about structure. How'd you like to do a presentation for us? And here he is. So we're very pleased and excited to have Mike here with us today. And Mike is going to say more about himself. So I'll just stop there and without further ado, hand things over to Mike. I'll come back again at the end to facilitate the Q&A.
Good morning, everyone. So as you can see, I work at a little company called Weedmaps. I'm the Atlassian administrator there. I also run the Confluence stuff and the rest of the Atlassian stack. And in many ways, I may have shot myself in the foot in that I went out of my way to go completely anti pattern. There's a lot of talk lately about making everything the same and everything operate the same way. But in my world, since we decided to go the route of everything lives and breathes in Jira, we have some rather interesting stuff. So I end up with a pathologically diverse user base. And when I say pathologically diverse, there's nobody more diverse than looking at developers, creatives, and legal in the same bucket as an example. So we end up having to run things rather differently. And this comment I make here about, diverse portfolios to manage as a result, I put portfolios in quotes here because there's the traditional type of portfolio for engineering projects, but I also end up with these portfolios that contain things from all these wildly diverse groups. They might be transitory as opposed to a rather more static portfolio. So we'll get into that as we go forward, but I have some rather interesting scenarios that I have to deal with. So I'll start with what prompted us to review our portfolio project management tool. We reached that wonderful point. We're still running on server, by the way. So of course we have that wonderful leap that Atlassian gives us that goes from 500 to 2,000 users. So part of that was upgrading all the plugins, and the portfolio plugin was, to say the least, expensive. And in fact, that was a significant portion of that upgrade. When I add in that most of Portfolio's features were being left on the floor in our world for a variety of reasons. Earlier versions felt and were buggy, and it didn't matter how often I updated the environment and extolled the virtues of the new features and the improvements. Not many people liked it a lot. When we started to look at, also as we're analyzing this, what we were getting out of it, with this and some of the other tools we reviewed, looking at what do we do if we don't use Portfolio, is many of them have their imposed way of how to manage a portfolio. And it may not be overt, but it might be, and it might be a covert way where they have a thought of, this is how you should manage a portfolio, therefore you will like it. And what it came down to is, with trying to operate this in our world, which isn't necessarily normal, we were pretty much only using the extra issue layers, like adding an initiative above Epic and driving that way. As we were looking through the new sets of tools, price wasn't necessarily a consideration. It was one of those cases where what drove it was the very high cost of upgrading Portfolio. But that wasn't necessarily consideration. If it cost a lot of money and I got a lot of value out of it, cool. But if it was costing a lot of value and I felt like I, wasn't getting everything, then not so much. One of the other things we run into is, in our world, with such a diverse user base, we needed to have flexibility in the style of how it operates and how you can use it, all those types of things, because everybody has their different way of looking at this thing. When I comment, ease of data and content maintenance, as many startups are, as they're transitioning into enterprise, as we've done, things change often, and we needed it so that it would be straightforward and simple and not difficult to change. This is how this looks. That falls right into that very next thing, snowflakes. We have a lot of snowflakes. We have long running snowflakes from a group that runs a certain way that's different from all the other groups, which is incidentally almost all of them. But then there's always, in our world, a special project that might run short-term, long-term, but encompass a huge number of people and groups and different methodologies and different functionalities and any number of things. So we had to be able to support all of those. Or rather, I'll back up and say, had to is a strong word, but it was a really good idea if we could. So based on that, what were we actually looking for? There's a couple of things. As I mentioned before, it has to be flexible. Part of the requirement, because things are often fluid, we had to be flexible so that there isn't any imposed way of operating a portfolio. My portfolio may not look like yours in any way, shape, or form. Most of the ones we looked at felt like almost a separate application on top of Jira, where you would select that function out of the menu and go, oh, this looks completely different. And then the issue type hierarchy needed to be largely arbitrary. Part of that reason is that we would run into cases where in one group there's a standard issue type, and to deliver that there might be a whole bunch of other standard issue types underneath of that, which, as we were going through these things, that was one of the things that structure gave us, where it was largely arbitrary. And ironically, using structure ended up meaning that we didn't have an imposed structure. We're also looking for a lot of ways to use the tools. A nice UI was critical because a lot of people, they live in the point and shoot world, and there's not one thing wrong with that, but it had to be good. So that was one of the parts of that. JQL extensions, that's another big one for us. A lot of people I've actually driven some courses in brown bags at the office to teach people how to use JQL, which incidentally cuts down hugely on the amount of day-to-day help me queries I get. But having those JQL extensions for people that have learned how to write JQL is a big deal. And then our wonderful grooviness, which means there's an API, I can get at a tool and be able to do things with it, which falls down into workflow. If I can get at the API through Groovy, then I can do things in the workflow so that I might be able to change a portfolio based on what happens in a certain step. Spoiler, we ended up going with structure, and the bonus was the portfolio upgrade was really expensive, just the upgrade, but actually purchasing structure was roughly half the cost of the upgrade. So that was our big bonus. We got our functionality, all of the things that I mentioned here, with the purchase being rather low. So what do portfolios look to us? And ignore the copyright on the bottom of this because I forgot to clean it out of the master slide. So our simplistic view of traditional portfolios, if you look at the left side of that, it looks like our engineering world. It's similar to anywhere else where in the past we had a thing. This is the thing we're delivering, and here's the cross-functional teams that deliver it, and here's the functions that deliver, just for the hierarchy there. That's where we were. A short time ago, we had a change in senior management, or rather we brought in new senior management. We're growing rapidly, so senior management grows a lot. They decided need to put another layer on top of that and have the business functions so that we can more closely align our engineering efforts with the business. Cool. Tomorrow, who knows? As I say, we grow, we change. And this is the same with any company, whether or not necessarily they're growing fast. A change in senior management can mean I want to do something different. This is where that importance in flexibility pops up, because even in a rather traditional, this is an engineering project portfolio, things can be rather fluid. So I'm going to look at a Jira Service Desk use case, just simply because this is a description of where portfolios take a hard left. And we've all seen these things where something comes into the service desk and it looks like a very simple request until you open it up and you look at it. And as an administrator, you go, huh, this is really big and really awful. So what I tend to do in my world is insert that customer service request into a portfolio that might be IT-ish in nature and perhaps has our IT engineering projects. The way we run it at our shop, of course, there is the help desk for just about everything, including, and we've actually got help desk for everything, including not just technology, but office and facilities and any number of things. And it helps a lot. But I also have a project set up that we in our corporate engineering group use to run our engineering projects. That one is laid out in a certain way with portfolios driven by structure, with all the different groups in our corporate engineering represented so that we can manage and see everything up front. So I'll insert that into one that I've got running for open Atlassian projects, which has, as you might expect, the engineering improvement projects, but this one will start to go in there, and I can then create all the other things that make this small request deliverable. And then share the portfolio view with the requester so they can see all the things that they asked for and they realize it's bigger than a bread box, and also see the status of it. Now this one is based on a real world one. It came in, a guy said, you know what, I'd like to track these simple things. Ended up not being a simple thing. It was from the marketing group. He needs to have a way to run his omni-channel notifications. So from that project that was the request that came into the service desk, I inserted it into the IT project's engineering run. From here then, we've got the first task that I add to this. You got to review the project requirements. This one was one of those ones that was big enough that I said, I kind of know what you want, but you need to write this down so that I have your full set of requirements. And he wrote a requirements definition document, a reasonable one, which we reviewed. And that turns into a lot of tasks. Interestingly enough, from when I put this slide deck together, which not that many days ago, that same screenshot, if I took it, thankfully, there's an awful lot more dones on it. One of the nice things about using structure for this is I can see my folder of my Atlassian projects, and this is a subset of it. So there's my portfolio of Atlassian projects. We can see that stray random help desk project, the IT one right at the top. But the pleasant thing now is I can insert other tasks from another project underneath that one. And I also don't have to worry about the hierarchy because those are all standard issue types underneath a standard issue type. And in fact, if you have a quick look at that, one of the pleasant things where I mentioned there isn't necessarily a structure to structure. At the upper level, of course, I've got the folder. The next level down is a mixture of standard and epic issue types. And at the next level down in that same hierarchy is a mixture of standard issue types and subtasks. And should I really feel the need, we might actually put an epic underneath of that. That seems a little silly, but it would allow to do that. And in case anyone's wondering, looking at the slide, I've updated Jira to the latest 8.50, love it. And I also did Confluence to 7.03, and that wasn't as good, but 7.04 was much better. And then in this same example here, because I added that to the structure, is when I'm looking at the detail view, which also helps any of our other service desk agents, the structure also is visible in the service desk ticket. And you can see where this ticket lives. And if we get somebody that's trying to review what the heck is this all about? Oh, that's a little bit bigger. And you can see it there. Now we're going to talk a little bit about these different kinds of portfolios. And I use this in a quote again, because this isn't necessarily a standard portfolio, except that it is. And so far we've looked at what almost all of us might think of us as a portfolio. And when I say longish term stable portfolio structure, it means I have an organization of how my tasks roll up into the projects, which roll into the tools, which roll into the portfolio of all the different tools that we're building. And it's typically comprised of any normal set of engineering or development. And I did look at a different look at a portfolio, which is going to drive what we talk about next, where it's a transitory effort, but it still needed to be in a portfolio so that we could demonstrate this isn't a simple ask. Here's all the things that it needs. but it also gives out a build out of, okay, Atlassian Administrator, I don't know what the heck it is you do here, but what is it you're doing? So for management and tracking, now all of a sudden they can see, oh, this simple thing isn't the same as go and give me a new network cable. This is a big deal. It's a project unto its own right. I've got the reporting for it, even for the transitory time that it's taking to do that. So let's look at some fun new ways of what a portfolio actually is. Here is an example of a non-development Jira cycle, that fairly recent one. This is actually a real shot, not a photo set, of the Weedmaps wrapped monorail in Las Vegas. This was a project in the creative realm, mostly creative, where everything moved through Jira, and it involved creative, marketing, legal, finance, public relations, corporate communications. We had the stakeholders in this had to do live reviews and we used Jira to track those. We had the executives to sign off on it. And yes, our executives do log into Jira and review tickets and approve them, move them through the workflow. It actually gets used that way. And in this case, we had several of those snowflakes. We have a large graphic arts department, and their world consisted of, here's what this needs to look like on this particular monorail. But then we were getting back samples from the vendor that was doing the wrap, and those were all being tracked in our world. Even in development where creative might be driving what's on those technical pages, we have the integration to Marvel so that we can see that, and having our portfolios stuck together so that in this world, the one overarching portfolio or the structure folder was the Weedmaps wrap monorail. All of those tickets existed within that. When I look at these snowflakes, and this comes back again to that pathologically diverse world, and you'll see a little bit more of it in the next slide. Every one of those groups operates in a different way. And while it can be extra work on my part to make it so that it fits their worlds, the flip side is we end up with a tool that is the single source of truth, and everything is tracked in one place. We don't have, some of it's in Jira, some of it's in Confluence, some of it's in Google Docs, some of it's in email, some of it's in Slack. It tends to all be in one place. And then a rather bigger one, if any of you happen to go and grep Google for the Weedmaps Museum of Weed, which is almost shut down. It was just a temporary one we had stood up in a building that we have in West Hollywood. This is a very large scale transitory type of a portfolio. And it ran the gamut of humans in our office that could work on a thing. Again, as with the wrapped monorail, everything that went to deliver and execute and operate the Weedmaps Museum of Weed were managed in Jira. Everything that moved for this went in there. And it's actually a portfolio of portfolios, which again required the flexibility of structure for us to be able to operate it, where the overarching portfolio, of course, was the Museum of Weed, but underneath of each one of those, every one of those groups, and I broke it out a little bit, had their own portfolio of functionalities to deliver this particular overall thing. If I look at, as an example, creative. Inside creative, there were a huge number of photo tasks, video tasks, graphics art tasks. And incidentally, even just within that one group, each one of those three things all operate vastly different from each other. yes, task comes in and something visual comes out the other side, but how they get from A to B is completely different. And every one of them have their own workflows, their own automatic assignments, and live in the portfolio in the different places depending on which state they're at. Legal's different than everybody else on the planet, but our legal department, that's where all our contracts for this thing were reviewed and executed. The content that went into it was reviewed and advised on. And each one of those two things, for instance, have different workflows, but it all lives in that one single portfolio for them, which rolls up to the big portfolio, which in turn gave the executive, the C-suite level, the view of where is this thing at today. And in this case, we end up with a rather big environment to operate some fairly big transitory projects. This one started earlier in the year. We're almost done with it now. But it does give me, as an Atlassian administrator, a lot of sense in a job well done by the fact that I could create and operate all of that for them. And some of the feedback you get when you provide them, not only the functionalities, but the visibility and the visualization. In our creative team, the director there said point blank, I couldn't be successful in my job without your tools. And in the legal department, one of our contracts administrators point blank said, I couldn't keep up with all the matters I have to deal with without Jira. So if we step back from thinking about Jira in terms of a purely engineering support tool, which is where it does shine, and think about it as a large process control and management presentation engine, adding Confluence for documentation, we can basically operate anything. So at this point, we'll open it for questions.
Great, thank you, Mike. So we have a number of questions in the queue here. Let's take a couple of the easy ones first. One of them is, did you evaluate anything other than structure when you were looking to move away from portfolio?
Yes, we did actually. We looked at big picture. We looked at portfolio as it was going forward in its own right. And most of the other ones, as I mentioned, when we looked at it, they were either, I could see either that imposed methodology of operating a portfolio, or it was expensive for what I was getting, or the other thing I ran into when I dropped it into the test instance was, I hate it. So basically any of the majors, we looked at them. I gave them all a good college try. Some of them I liked because I had a baked in risk management. I have to use a separate one here, but this one answered all of the boxes for me.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question, besides the cost of portfolio, you mentioned that for whatever reason within your organization, there wasn't a lot of portfolio fans or champions for the product.
Sure.
Why do you think that is?
In our world, it probably largely came down to it. I'll break this up. I'll back up a little bit. Initially, it was because portfolio in its earlier days was limited and it didn't do all the things they wanted to. So it started to use just a handful of the pieces because, yes, this solves this problem today, but then it was coded around with Groovy and listeners and a whole bunch of other things. Even as portfolio grew, and in all respects, yes, it got quite a lot better, it's still, there was I ran up against a mindset, portfolio won't do it for me. Even when I demonstrated it, yes, it does that very well, but I want to do it this way. And you couldn't force it to do it. And it just was way too rigid, where I couldn't have, as that one slide show, just absolutely no structure going into making a rigid structure that made sense to me.
Okay. Another question from the audience here is, you mentioned that your executives log in to Jira and use Jira. are they using, how are they using Jira is the question. Are they, and I imagine they're asking, are they using the straight Jira interface? Are they using Structure? Or are they using Jira?
So that question right there is one of those bigger than a bread box questions. It depends on the executive, and it depends on what role they use it. One of the things that this is outside of Structure, but one of the first things I did was put in approval mechanisms for Jira Service Desk. I've got every manager and executive used to the fact that if they don't do it when they see it, they're going to get a reminder. Here's a particular ticket for you to approve or deny. That's one part of it. Curiously enough, the more technical executives are the lower users. The non-tech ones are the ones that use it the heaviest. And yes, I do have executives, both in the legal department and in the creative department, creative/marketing department, that look at structure views all the time that are driven by their directors underneath of them. But more importantly is that whole part of them logging in and doing things. Some of them are looking at them right at the ticket detail view, because one executive said, I will get approvals from executives, and it's going to be they log in and push a go button. And they're looking at the ticket, and I had to make sure I had the workflows written that only the button necessary was available at the top, but they are looking at the ticket. They might be editing the issue. The use is pervasive in our company. So yes, all the executives are using it, and some of the more militant executives that say, we will all use this, are driving the other ones to use it more as well.
So a follow-on question from the same person. How long did this take to get your organization, the entire organization, using Jira?
Well, I've been here for about 2.5 years. And there was a fair amount of good usage when I came in here, but in many ways, the environment I inherited was a dumpster fire with extra hobos. And to get to the state I'm at today has taken largely this whole 2.5 years. First, to chase off the hobos, because there's, every one of us still have, if we're honest with ourselves, in some respects, a dumpster fire we're administering. But that was a big chunk of spending the time with the customers, demonstrating that, yes, I do a little bit more with this environment than what you're used to, and I can make it do more things. So there was a Pied Piper thing, convince a couple of them so that a group beside them would see, oh, that's really cool, I want that too. And when we started to build up that roll up, where I would actively spend the time to go out and I'd see somebody that's trying to operate their team or group or whatever process with that horrible mixture of spreadsheets and Slack and email and everything. And it's just please stop doing that. I can make you a tool to do this. So yes, it took that 2.5 years, and it's still growing. There's still little pockets that haven't been rolled in yet, or full functionality hasn't been developed yet, but we're still growing it and still making it smarter. And it'll be an evolutionary thing, even as people move in and out, processes changes, it never stops. But it's also interesting in that I don't build up something and stand it up and then just keep it happy. I'm always building and making it better.
Great. Next question is, one of the attendees has observed that doesn't the flexibility of structure also lead to more quote unquote snowflakes rather than a rationalizing of the efforts?
Well, the short answer to that is yes. The longer answer is no. What this allows with that strong flexibility is for the snow, I can build a system that's an 80% solution, and I don't have to put the enormous effort that always goes into getting that last 10 or 20% rolled in, which almost always ends up making you delivering an exception-based system. And those are just a monumental nightmare to maintain. As such, without that definitive forced impose structure to things. I can let the snowflakes exist, but pull them into perhaps a rather more formal structure, and they can run along beside it just fine without it having to be special for them.
I'm going to ask this question because I think it might relate to the previous question.
Sure.
How many custom issue types do you have in your environment?
You know, I haven't done a inventory of it, but the list is long. And in fact, that one that I had up as an example ended up being 4 more issue types. So I would guess I'm many dozens. I don't think I'm over 100, but I've got a lot of them. And in fairness, a lot of times I wouldn't necessarily need to do that, but it doesn't hurt me to do that. And it gives every one of the groups something that means semantically what they think it means, as opposed to, oh, I read X and for me that means Y. So I end up with hundreds of issue types, not hundreds, but 100 plus. But it doesn't hurt, and it's important, and it helps for the adoption, which does get to that place where literally nothing moves that doesn't go through Jira. And that's the same with the workflows. I might end up with some monstrously specific workflows for a monstrously specific function, but then it's running in there, and it's not running in Airtable or a spreadsheet or something like that.
Okay. Next question is an observation from another attendee is, isn't structure just another layer on top of Jira?
You know, in some ways, yes. In other ways, no. In many ways, it's a presentation layer that lets me drag things into various different hierarchies and organizations. But I do have that folder functionality, which is a very simple and easy way of saying this folder of things is this particular portfolio. That's pretty cool. And part of it being another layer on top of it means that for that part of it where it is, means that it lets those who want to run Jira the way they're used to can operate it exactly that way. Whereas I've got this management layer on top that's not imposing how I manage things, to group all those things and present it and visualize it and any number of things. So it both is and isn't another layer. And that's part of why it ends up being a pleasant tool for me to solve the problems that I've got.
Okay, here's another question. It's a two-part question. Do you customize each new project, and how on earth are you doing all of this alone?
Well, yes, I customize each project, but, and how I do it alone is, even where it's massively customized, I have a lot of building blocks that I use where I know this particular grooviness works in this functionality here. And if I just point at a different project and different custom field as the conditions or what it does in the workflow or any number of things, it short cycles how I do that. So I reuse a lot of the same functionality, and even a lot of the rather different workflows, I'm able to share some of them amongst different groups because they have the same functionality. But even where they're not, the post functions, conditions, validators are similar enough in their functionality that a lot of times all I'm changing is what I had to do to make that particular function semantically correct for that group. Functionally, it does exactly the same thing. It's just the semantics that change for it. And yes, it is sometimes a little bit difficult to do it on my own, but the flip side of that is that as I get better at this and make things more for them, my customers then start to see, I want mine to look exactly like this. And other than semantic changes, it is almost a complete drop-in. And even simple things, notification schemes, I've been able to boil those down to a handful that get the right information to the right people without Jira being a car alarm like the default notification scheme is. And even that's a simple one. What do you want your notification to look like? Here's my menu. Same thing with project permissions. Here's a handful of permission schemes I've got that operate a certain way. How tight or how loose do you want this? So a lot of the ugly stuff is easier that way. In the early days when I didn't have those building blocks, yeah, it was some days sucked mud a lot, but it's better every day, and I've got a happy user base.
So this to me looks like a related question. What are you using anything, a plugin, for example, to create these scripts?
There's a couple of the staples that I've got in here behind this thing. One of them, of course, is Script Runner, which lets you get really ugly. And if you're not careful, you'll DOS your system with a badly run script that's not trapping nulls, for example. Another one that I use heavily, it's actually a two-parter from the same company. It's Jira Miscellaneous Custom Workflows and Jira Miscellaneous Custom Fields. Or sorry, Jira Miscellaneous Workflow Extensions. Those are between the two of them with the fields and the extensions that it provides. Those are kind of a Swiss Army knife of doing things. So where JMWE might not reach all the way and Script Runner goes the rest of the way, the custom fields, the JM custom fields get most of what I need, but for the ones that have to be really complex and ugly, then I've got Script Runner for that. There's a handful of other things just for the notifications, just to keep life simple. I use Notification Assistant so that I can trap stale stuff or have tickets that get created but not notified until a certain time before a due date, and Notification Assistant lets me do that. There's a handful of others in there, but between those and then the automations in Jira Service Desk, I've been able to build out pretty much all of this.
Great. Another question from one of our previous questioners. How many projects do you have on your instance of your 2000 user instance?
I have, last time I looked, it was about 150 projects in there. That sounds awful, but a lot of it is the building blocks that might be, here's the particular functional thing that rolls up to delivering a overall product, which rolls up into another one. The other part of it is that where I've got cases that when you try to run a super project, marketing as an example, you end up, because there's so many things that operate in violently different ways in there, you end up with a project with a huge number of issue types, a huge number of workflows, a huge number of screens, and it becomes untenable to manage. So a lot of times I'll split those out. That's not to say they don't still work together. A lot of the workflows I've got so that things happen automatically and do stuff for the users so they don't have to, or it doesn't get, or it gets missed or gets done wrong, is creating tickets from, I get to a certain point in a certain workflow and then I need input and functions from another group, and it'll create the ticket, link them, and then look at its status to be able to transition through to the next one. So it sounds awful with that many projects, but it actually breaks it down to where at a super level, the project is almost an issue type, but underneath those issue types is a whole bunch of the different functionalities that drive it. Content marketing, for instance, in our world, that used to be an issue type with a whole bunch of options underneath of it, and that became difficult to run. So we built a content marketing project, which then underneath of that has news tickets, it has content tickets, it has PR tickets, all the different things that we might write for. And that way they can run precisely the way they need to. It's visible and easy to manage, and they like to use it because they can see only their stuff.
Okay, this looks like it could be the last question, unless somebody else throws another one in. Are you using any of the automation capabilities of Structure?
Yeah, I am. Some of the ones that are inherent, but most of the ones that I'm doing because we are so far down the rabbit hole of customization, either with automation for Jira or with workflow post functions and many other things like that. We're driving it from the bottom up that way. That lets us keep each one of those groups where those really ugly customizations are in one place. But I'm not going to preclude using automations right up at the structure level as well yet either.
Okay, great. So that's all the questions we have today, Mike. And I want to thank you again for a great presentation. Could we have the last slide, please? So for those of you that stayed with us through the end of the presentation, we've got one more slide that just has a couple of suggested next steps.
You know what? I seem to be at the tail end of this one here, Dave.
Oh, okay. Well, let's not worry about it then.
Oh, look, there we go.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, great. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there will be a video archive for today's webinar. It usually takes about 1 to 2 business days for us to get that posted. You'll be able to find it on our YouTube channel. So if you can use this shortened URL, alm.work/YouTube, and you'll find a playlist there of what called Webinar Archive, and you'll be able to see this and all of the other webinars we've conducted this year. And we've got a lot of other videos on YouTube as well that you might be interested in. If you want to learn more about Structure, if any of you are not yet using Structure and you want to learn more about it, you can use this shortened URL, alm.work/structure. That'll take you to the Atlassian Marketplace where you'll find Structure. And lastly, if there's anything else at all, you think of a question for Mike that you weren't able to ask today, or you forgot to ask today, you need to learn anything from ALM Works, whatever it might be, you can always send an email to webinars@almworks.com. We'll make sure that you get the answer to that question, even if it requires us to direct it to somebody else, like Mike, for example. So that's it for today. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate your attendance and participation, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.